Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to a Lunch and Learn, all about a very different topic. We're going to try to build empathy for people who are joint ventures owners and minds that don't actually have a operating say in traditional sense. And we're going to talk about the lack of empathy between different owners. One of the largest owners in all forms of real estate, whether it be mining, whether it be houses or other things, is the government. They get royalties, they get taxes, they get property taxes, they get any number of things. But traditionally, they don't get to make operating decisions. We're going to talk about how transparency might help shift culture. How can we fundamentally shift culture through transparency? I think that's the goal of this. But before we get
And
there,
I think
yeah, Ben,
with that in mind, they really are a joint venture partner.
the government is
Just a
the biggest
silent
joint
one.
venture partner.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
they're as big as a trading company. They're as big as Sumitomo. The government in all minds are the joint venture partner. They're the silent one, and they're the one that does not necessarily get the respect they deserve because they're the joint venture partner that is the partner of last resort. So
Yeah.
they get to be during operations, they get to be treated as a secondary partner, and then when the mine
Mushroom.
closes, they're the primary partner. It's an interesting relationship. So we have a joint venture relationship with governments as an industry. And part of creating a healthy relationship is actually trying to build empathy for the person on the other side. So the question I've been asking recently is, does our industry deliver a return to local, not global, to local governments that makes sense for local governments? Meaning, do we actually create more than we take on a local basis? Now, before you sit here and say, oh, we have cell phones, we have computers, we have all of that, we'll get there. But the question is, what is the relationship with the local governments where we do most of our environmental impact? So let's be clear. We are in the business of transferring wealth. We mine ore, we deplete water, we build massive tailing structures, we leave environmental legacy, we transfer wealth from the local to the global. I have a lovely pad that I drafted this presentation on. I have a stunning cell phone which solves all sorts of problems. I even have new earpods to try to play with on the airplane to fly to South America next week. I get all the advantages of the copper.
Nice.
For me, the copper is a lovely, lovely thing. My life is stunning for the joy of copper. Okay, there's green energy, there's pumps, there's schooling, there's any number of things that we fundamentally create because we do mining. The question is, the overall big macro, does mining make sense question works. But how do we deal with the local governments and the local communities? How do we fundamentally shift that from a local governmental perspective? Do you want to add something there, Ben?
Yes. Um, I think it does work. It may not work equally for every metal and every commodity we mine. So it's important to always keep that in mind. Um, the other thing is mining's getting harder. We've talked about it again and again. We're not finding ore bodies, the grade's dropping, um, getting resources to actually process our materials like water is becoming more of a challenge. And on top of all that being against us, the world needs more and more of certain metals. There's not a day go by we don't see news articles on, oh, there's a critical mineral list here, there's a new critical metal mine, or our personal favorite, copper. We are not making the discoveries. So there's this amazing transfer of wealth, but everything that's going to impact the local community when we do come into mine is magnifying that impact on them as well. So this is an issue we've really got to tackle and think about how we best address it as a collective.
So let's be very clear. Governments currently are reactive. Okay, so we have basically two ways that I believe we got two basic ways our brains work. One is we have proactive decisions. I need something for 2025. I'm going to put together the team to build the resources so we can scale up the education that me and Ben do, because we believe the work we do is important. That's a proactive thing. We're changing the future. Reactive is someone's come in and someone has given you a contract that doesn't make sense to you. And you get frustrated, you get angry, and you focus on, I want more of the pie. I want more, I want more, I want more. So I think there's a range of reactions that we're going to get from governments as the energy transition massively changes the magnitude of our local impact. If we need to double or triple the copper production, if we need to double or triple the lithium production, we're talking about massively increasing the size of our impact onto very, very small populations. And the choices really range all the way from one, which is focused on taxation ownership. You can see that in Panama. You can see that in Chile when they renegotiate tax treaties on a regular basis. You can see that even in the US, where we're fundamentally focusing on how much of the ownership does the government get. You can even see that with De Beers in Botswana, where the debate is, should De Beers fundamentally be owned by the government as the diamond market degrades? Or you can focus on looking at the government as a joint venture partner. So how can we fundamentally maximize the return on depleted local natural capital? How can we fundamentally change that from that perspective? So when you look at this range of things, you fundamentally have to ask a question. Which way do we want to do this? Now, I'm going to add two more caveats. One is the global world is pushing for metal and will economically put systems in place that will fundamentally make doing the right thing maybe impossible. And on top of that, we fundamentally have social contracts that once they're grandfathered in, once they are set up, we aren't willing to necessarily renegotiate them. So we end up with these mature mines where the social contract, the closure costs, the other things, the ways the government is the joint venture partner expected to pick up the bill are not negotiated well at the end. And we end up with very, very bad legacy history. Do you want to add something, Ben?
Yeah, and I suppose that's the ultimate. You just segued into it then. So many times a mine is sold on before its end of its useful life. Then a smaller company takes it. Then they may sell it on. And ultimately companies come and go bust. But the liabilities are left there. And quite often the government gets to pick up the liabilities, whether they wanted to or not.
Because they're the joint venture partner.
Yeah, they're a joint venture partner. They're the stakeholder. And ultimately, the buck does stop with them because there's quite often no one else left to actually fix up the site if it's not looked after correctly and put to bed nicely. So maybe we need a different approach to thinking about this.
We're going to talk about two ways to look at this. We're going to first talk about metrics, and then we're going to talk about the size of the price. We're going to talk about metrics from a method of changing from a sympathetic response to the government to an empathetic response. So sympathetic is we're grounding this on ourselves. We are fundamentally making a decision that we care about the metrics that matter to us and versus the metrics that matter to the government. I'm going to flip this around. So sympathetic metrics for the mining industry would be, hi, I want to worry about my revenue per net cubic meter, my revenue per total cubic meter of water, my profit per cubic meter. I want to focus on me. Empathetic metrics are metrics that matter to the community, metrics that matter to the people around the community. So jobs per cubic meter, GDP growth per cubic meter of water, tax revenue per cubic meter of water, school teachers hired per cubic meter of water depleted. If you shift the metrics to fundamentally focus from a governmental perspective on what is being gained for the natural capital depletion, all of a sudden you're going to end up with a different perspective. You're going to end up with an empathetic response to dealing with your government joint venture partner. We're going to call them a joint venture partner versus fighting with your joint venture partner. Does that make sense? Because if I focus on metrics that are mine, and I treat my joint venture partner as a sympathetic response, which is your job is to support me to do my stuff because you don't have a say, then you're going to end up in natural conflict. And we think metrics can actually reduce conflict versus increase conflict. Does that make, Ben, I'm going to flip back a slide. I did this backwards. I realized I wanted to do it backwards. So We need to tie metrics in that fundamentally value our license to operate, that integrate the return on human capital for the government and for other people, that fundamentally quantify, qualify, and create the stories, while still respecting that we have real business constraints. If Angela is the best metallurgist in the world, she still can't run a copper flotation circuit without water. She can't take the water use to zero. It's still going to be a fundamental business constraint. But my bet is if Angela and Ben got together and decided they wanted to maximize revenue per cubic meter of water or tax revenue per cubic meter of water, they could massively improve the return for the government on the natural capital depleted.
And isn't it an interesting one? We don't necessarily react when there's something that may be even obvious where we could potentially make a gain. But as soon as someone mentioned, oh, we're going to tax that or penalize you for that, or there's some loss associated with not doing these things efficiently, human nature, we suddenly get very excited about it and very motivated to go find a solution so we can get taxed less.
But what happens if instead of focusing on the negative, let's focus on the positive? How can we fundamentally create a healthier partnership? Because we are, whether we like it or not as industry, we can't move. If I am Nike and I want to move where I make my shoes, I can move it. We can't move the ore bodies. So we better realize we're in long-term partnerships. And that's where we're going with this.
Yeah, that point again was made. I know you've just finished this book and I'm almost finished it, in The War Beneath, The War Below, where one person talks about the lithium mines in the Western United States. And the local passionate environmental person says, I'll be happy if you just move the mine a bit.
5 miles.
Unfortunately, the mine is where the plant was. So they're symbiotic.
And the plant that liked the ground because of the lithium in the ground. This particular plant likes lithium. Yep. We like lithium. We both can't have the lithium. Yep. And there might be a bit of conflict. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Okay, we're trying to figure out how to reduce, not increase conflict.
No, and we want to talk about perspectives, because every different stakeholder has a perspective, and that's one of the important starting points here. Thinking about what the government thinks, thinking about what the mining company thinks, and figuring out how we can both win.
Now, part of the problem we have is we don't understand the value of partial optimization. We are sitting here and saying, well, we are going to get to the best, the perfect direct lithium extraction with absolutely perfect water use, and we're going to get the maximum metal per cubic meter of net water removed from the cellars. And people, you can very quickly get to a ratio of about $3,200. But even if you switch from traditional lithium extraction to the very easiest DLE modifications, which are, I think, feasible today, you can double the value of water. But let's flip to copper, where the lithium is a bit tricky because it's debatable on how these things work. The copper numbers here are not debatable at all. It is very easy to take a mine. I think this particular mine was set at 0.5 or 0.6 head grade, from $83 of revenue per cubic meter of water to $150. That's all proven technology that Angela will happily train you on tomorrow. Okay, it's thickener control systems, it's a 2-stage hydrocyclone on the tails, it's a slightly different flotation circuit. It's absolutely nothing that you work around. DLE is direct lithium extraction, Angela.
You beat me to it.
So it's all the different technologies around how you do lithium, and people are debating DLE. The copper is guaranteed on these bases. The DLE is not. If I fully optimize a mine, I put in dry stack tails, I set up everything, I let Ben Murphy adjust the flotation circuit, I let you and a couple mining engineers optimize the pit, I believe you can easily get copper to $273 of revenue per cubic meter. Now, if you're talking about a poor community and you can take one of the scarce resources and shift the revenue per cubic meter with attached tax base, attached schooling, attached resources from $80 to $270, where in the world is that a bad thing? Is that make sense? When we talk about our local social contract to operate, shifting to a KPI that's based on the value and use of the natural capital means you can massively improve your government contracts purely by just doing a better job. But the thing is, if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, do people value that? So we have to start building dashboards and rational relationships with governments based around metrics that matter to the government. Does that make sense? You add anything there, Ben?
Probably in our intro, and I think most of you on the call have been in one of our classes or sessions before. If you disagree, agree, love, hate, whatever, feel free to throw a comment in the chat or even just put your hand up or holler out, and we're willing to discuss these topics.
So Cheryl, the government is the people, but in a lot of
Yes.
these instances, government is a relatively abstract theory. I like the concept of, oh, we have got a government elected by the people, for the people, and all those things. But if I spend time in, I'm going to pick a location, rural Argentina, the BA is viewed as a wholly separate entity to the people. The people who are making decisions in Santiago are not the same people who live near the mine in
Kalama.
the Kalama. So a lot of what we have to do is we have to create metrics that fundamentally show all levels of government, including the ones that are not directly representative, how to maximize value. Because we have this lack of culture, we have a lack of understanding. The biggest thing me and Ben are learning as we teach on a larger scale is you get people that are incredibly powerful that don't understand the value or their KPIs or the silos they're in. And they're making decisions that are completely counterintuitive to what they want because they're not necessarily tied either to the ore body or to the people on the location.
Yeah, if I could just say a couple of things, just as an ex-bureaucrat, I think we kind of forget that government, as much as we have strong, powerful people, ultimately there's a huge difference between somebody being powerful and not understanding versus just powerful and depleting and doing horrible things to environment. I mean, I think policy is a huge piece that is underestimated in its impact. So policy people understanding the impacts they have is so important. But when I go back to, we talk about government as abstract, but the reality is, the people, it's the people's central piece. And I understand that's, geopolitics, everything's different across the world. But ultimately, I continue to hear everybody talk about the government's like totally abstract. The reality is people take this back and be able to speak to what you guys are saying is really understand the impacts we're having as people. Then we don't have such abstract items happening. And so it's having an educated and active in democracy, basically. I'm talking about non-democratic areas.
We 100% agree with you. The entire last part of this is all about the people. Yeah. The way we laid this out was we started with the quantification of is there value to be driven from a mining industry perspective versus from a government perspective? Because we other people in power in relationships, we other the government, we other the environmental community, we other people who disagree with us, we other people who are outside of our industry. And that's a fundamental problem. So the key is to start by saying, hey, if we actually do better with ourselves, can we empathetically attach that to other people that we've dehumanized? Because I'd argue the mining industry is, and in line with you, Cheryl, does an incredible job of dehumanizing the government, the evil government, the this, the that. I mean, heck, I'm an American. I can tell you all that dehumanizing. Yeah, I mean, you pick the things. A lot of what got me to think about this was I moved to a town that functions and works. And I was watching them water the plants on the street posts. I'm like, yeah, I like paying for that. I really like going for a walk and seeing hanging plants on every street post that are pretty. Like, I like paying for the parks and going and seeing the water fountains. I like everything being clean. You started to shift from this city doesn't work to, yeah, I value being here. Cool. So we have multiple papers on how we model metrics. We can talk about that.
Going back to the simplest example, because we have time, do you just want to flip back to the previous slide, Benjamin?
Sure.
I think it's the previous slide with the table, the famous table. So, Peggy, basically, and let's pick on water because we love water and it's simple. We know roughly for a given mine site how much water we need to make a pound of copper. It's simple. We know how many pounds of copper that mine site makes. Pick your commodity, gold, lithium, whatever. We know how much water it uses. Therefore, and we know how much water it needs. So we can suddenly say, well, this is the value of the copper we produce with this much water. Therefore, the value of each unit of water is this much. It's really not that hard to do. It's a mindset change because in engineering school, we're not taught to think this way. We're taught to think about, and accounting school, we're taught to think about costs, and people are very good at knowing costs. But often they've never flipped it to think about the value. Is it a precise number? No, but it's a fantastic starting point. And if you bring it back to that, you can start working it through. Similarly for other metrics, people, energy, you name it.
And we're not saying be evil and just focus on the lack of a story around the people, around the counterparties. We're saying the metrics that we believe management should build for themselves have as much value to all other stakeholders.
Yep.
We believe that if we get metrics to be rational in our industry, we're going to value things that we currently don't. And when we start valuing things, that's when we change how we deal with them. And that's how we change the way we deal with other people. Because the big thing I'm taking away right now, it's us versus them.
Yeah.
That's not going to work if we need to quadruple our copper production. Like, we're just not going to get it. We better start working with the people closest to us. And some of that is local and national governments around the world.
Yep.
So,
Ben just mentioned about accountants, like at engineers, how we've got our, goals or whatever. Accountants have their goals, or, the company, okay, so that was, my first thought was the company essentially looking at their motivation being the next quarterly report that they have to meet. The engineers were up, us in the field. Our thing is, okay, maybe the next few months, I want to have a good job, review, when salary increases come at the end of the year or whatever, I want to be in a good position. The accountants probably as well on a similar time scale. Governments may be a little bit longer because they're looking at the next election. So I think it's difficult when everyone's motivation is within the next year or 4 years or 5 years, whatever maximum, to plan a 20, 30-year mine life and to operate it. I mean, you can plan it, but once people get their hands on it, and then the tonnage pushers start to say, okay, let's push tonnage, even though we're not operating very efficiently, our extra tonnage will cover that up and no one will see that because we're making more production, even though it's not as efficient. And so the only one example that I can think of that goes contrary to all that is China, because they do have a culture of taking the long view and putting it into practice. And guess what's happened with all the rare earth metals? So, anyway, so that's, I think, something that has to be resolved in addition to sort of breaking down silos, is getting everybody to focus on the longer term, because if you break down the silos and we're all very effectively looking at the next quarterly report, I don't know how much of a benefit that would be.
And
yeah.
The first thing
I don't think the 25 years life of mine is the issue. It's the 500 years of closure that also matters.
Yeah. But until people
These are
understand
very
that,
long assets.
until people understand that, we're not going to change that mindset. It's very easy to say 500 years, I won't be here. It's not my problem. Yeah. Cool.
So why do these metrics work for everyone? And let's start humanizing people who say everyone. Fundamentally, if we start actually attaching financial value to the natural capital we deplete, we can then start to maximize our local return. We can start changing these things. So in most of the world, you can't see revenue and royalty for individual mining assets. This is not a global south problem. This is a global problem. We're not particularly good at reporting these things. We are arguing that companies that operate with better understanding of the value they deplete will work better with governments, and governments will work better with those companies. We're arguing that creating transparency around value and use of natural capital will make the social license better. That's what we're arguing. But we'll get there. So we can produce a lot more metal if we start valuing the things that we deplete. That's our view. We believe that attaching returns, now, yes, we're still not going to solve that rare plant that likes to eat lithium. We're still not going to solve figuring out how to mine pebble. There's a whole number of places where we probably should or should not mine. There's going to be lots of places where this is not going to be solvable. But we can fundamentally shift the return on the natural capital of where we do mine. We can fundamentally make the business more sustainable. And it's just not that hard. It's about shifting from total footprint or total value to value in use. It's about shifting to the math and shifting to humanizing the math. So let's talk through the humanization from two perspectives. Let's start by talking about what is the value of the prize, and let's talk about what we need to do to change the price, to bring up Cheryl's point. And now I wish I'd written the presentation backwards because it would have made Cheryl happy. It's funny, you write these things and you write the order and then you realize that, oh, wait a second, I flipped everyone else's needs. Me and Ben always start with quantification versus the human, and maybe we should start with the human versus the quantification. Oh, well, good fun. So let's stop for a second and just talk about the magnitude of the prize. We believe, in simple terms, that the current copper assets can produce at least 10 to 20% more copper than they would if they didn't optimize their natural capital use. Okay, and we'll break down where the three main drivers are of quantification from a value and use perspective. We're going to shift from water to valuing the natural capital of the ore. So we're going to shift mediums from one commodity to another. And we apologize, but it'll help explain things. First, recovery versus throughput. We believe that if you just look at recovery and maximize recovery as the goal, most operations can shift recovery between 2 and 5% by controlling grind size, by optimizing things, by fundamentally looking at the ore as maximizing revenue per ton of ore or minimizing tails grade. If you fundamentally make minimizing tails grade the #1 KPI, you're going to fundamentally shift recovery by that amount. Now, that's without shifting concentrate grade necessarily. That's 2 to 5%, assuming you keep concentrate grade or the product grade you ship flat. 2 to 5% in most mining operations is the equivalent of funding the high school and the middle school and the grade school near the mine. 2 to 5% in tax revenue is massive. This is a material shift purely by shifting how you operate versus necessarily shifting the equipment that you're operating with. Now, if you can also shift the equipment, it can probably get slightly better.
And we're not talking about pie in the sky changes. We're talking about things we know how to do, but perhaps mining companies and people within mining companies aren't necessarily motivated to do it because of some of the prevailing, there's nothing forcing them to do it. There's no one holding them accountable for this because potentially someone who's setting the regulation, giving them their license to operate, et cetera, doesn't understand these nuances. Now, maybe they shouldn't be forced in a lot of cases to do this, but there is an argument there. Once again, none of these topics we're talking about has an easy, simple one-line answer. It's a complex problem. It's usually a trade-off. But unless we educate our counterparties and other stakeholders, we're never going to improve the situation.
Cool. And we're coming up with just one very small, this is not the all solutions. We're trying to, the moment you shift to an empathetic response from a sympathetic response to other stakeholders, these are the types of changes that can come out of it. This is about a change in culture. 2, we believe that resources are going to change. We believe the moment you start valuing resources based on the natural capital they're depleted, what is ore and what is not ore will quickly change. Especially, as Pim noted, if you price sulfides in tailings dams at a rational price point. The moment you price the sulfides at a rational price point, you fundamentally will start mining and processing, I think upwards of 20 to 30% shift from the reserve to resource line on most mines, because it's going to be worth more to put it through the mill to avoid the environmental liabilities that is a form of natural capital you're depleting than have it go to the tailings dam. Yep. So we're going to shift how we fundamentally do this. And before you tell me, oh no, we don't want to shift that, The tails that we're talking about are still higher grade than the average junior copper mine that's listed on the TSX. These are still pretty rich deals. So we're talking about taking existing mines and operating them better. So we think that there's going to be a massive shift in what is resource and what is not in the next 10 years. That's door number 2 from pricing natural capital.
And if you're a CEO of a TSX listed junior copper miner, there's always someone to talk to.
Yeah, not us.
I make light of it, but this is a reality.
Yeah.
The grade is concentrated on one part of the planet. Yeah, it's not fair, but it is how it is. So we need to adapt to that.
Finally, we believe in the next 10 years, the siloed between the smelter optimization versus mine optimization is going to completely shatter. With TCRCs going to zero, which is where they are now, with the copper market shifting to a massive lack of concentrate, we are going to fundamentally see a massive reduction in concentrate grades. If you're willing to drop your concentrate grade by 5 or 10%, and before you tell me that's impossible, I worked as a commodity trader for 2 years. It's very possible. I'm not asking for rocket science here. The moment we're going to accept across the board 18, 20% concentrate grades, we're going to do 2 things that are going to change the world. One is we're going to massively increase recovery. This is on top of the agnostic recovery from shipping process. So between these 2 things, we could be running copper mines in the 90% average recovery versus the 80s. That's a lot of money to governments from changing 2 things. Finally, as Pim pointed out, we will massively reduce the long-term tailings liability because we're going to pull the sulfides out of the tailings dam. We're going to reduce the long-term risk of dam failure. All because we change how we value the natural capital. All 3 of these things are driven by shifting to KPIs that are mutually beneficial. The dialectic is the company gets better and the government gets better with disclosure. If people are all talking, the decisions will get much better on how we operate. That's where we're coming from.
Sorry, with the sulfides in the tailings dam, you're going to reduce the long-term impact, especially if there is a tailings dam failure.
Because the person who gets the JV partner that gets the tailings dam liability is the local and national governments. And I don't care if we name them as Bob, Sally, or Jane, or we put individual departments on that. The governments end up being the final backstop for tailings dam liability, and we have to be aware of that. And we have to start making decisions that rationally take that into account. So how do we do this? Now, this comes back to my brain is absolutely fried. Peggy's question, and Peggy, please apply to our program this year. We'd love to have you. So first off, we fundamentally believe that valuing the depletion of natural capital, valuing the water, valuing the ore, valuing the tailings dams changes how we use it. So we believe there's 3 things that have to happen. One is we have to teach how to value. 2, we have to teach how to tell the story, how to fundamentally build the business case. And 3, coming back to Cheryl's perspective, we have to humanize people. We have to fundamentally get everyone to be able to build an emotional reaction to more than themselves. I was remarkably bad at this in my career. I used to be all about Benjamin. It's about the Benjamins. Quite jokingly, I used to be 100% focused on humanizing myself. But one of the things that happens when you start valuing natural capital is you start humanizing other people. So how do we do this? Well, I'll tell you how me and Ben are doing it. We believe the key to this is education. We believe that fundamentally we have a fundamental consent problem in our industry. We have a consent problem where once we get our license to operate, consent process ends because we now have a status quo of how this works. We have grandfathered consent in a lot of operations where we're not necessarily allowed to discuss how we got there, why we got there. And then we are absolutely shocked when things like Panama happen, where we lose our license to operate. We're absolutely surprised that we have not maintained informed counterparties. We have not given our counterparties the data to trust that we are doing the right thing. This is the culture that we need to shift. We need to get to the point where we have a culture where Bob, who works at pick your government body that regulates me, trusts that I'm using my water to maximize the value and to minimize the local destruction, and I'm actually a good citizen. But I can tell Bob all I want, but in some perspective, I have to tell Bob in 3 different languages. I have to give him numbers, I have to give him a story, and I have to have an emotional connection. I need to generate all 3 of those things. I also need to shift away from quarterly thinking. I need to start thinking about the fact that these relationships, this government joint venture, is with people that are going to be my partner for the rest of the life of the mine. I can't get rid of them. I can't fire them. I can't say, Angela, I hate your metallurgy. Go work someplace else. I cannot fire this joint venture partner. So I better learn how to supply them with information so they understand with a voluntary basis that what I am doing makes sense for them and for me. Now, getting to the final point, Cheryl, which is secondary core issues. There are so many layers of these counterparties who all have all the say and none of the say and are all human, that you end up with a really, really hard time building empathy because it's almost impossible to know who you need to be empathetic for. But I'm going to make a really horrible statement as someone who is a cis het white male, i.e. I'm a straight white guy with middle age with all the privilege, is if I can build empathy for at least one other person, odds are I'm going to build it for 3 or 4. Just trying to do this sort of educated counterparty consent will make things work better. We're not saying it's going to replace community engagement. We're not going to say it's going to be replacing those things. We're going to say it's going to change, because bringing in the quantification, bringing in the understanding of the value and use will change how this works out.
But making sure the counterparties do understand it, or at least have a level to negotiate it. Back in colonial days, Western explorers turned up, threw some covered glass or other baubles at natives and purchased tracts of land. There was no consent. The native people at that stage didn't necessarily understand what they were giving up or the value of what they were getting. And that's sort of been a model we've continued on for a number of years, especially in our industry, unfortunately. We need to move past that. If we want to be a sustainable industry, and we're not going to go into mining is not sustainable, that's a whole other discussion. But if we want to be an industry who's invited in and can be allowed to build mines to solve some of the world's big challenges at the moment, we need to educate that counterparty. We need to have the consent given on an informed basis.
Yeah, and not initial, ongoing, which is a very different standard. Now, let's talk about the problem, the biggest problem. We have got 90,000 people in 90,000 roles who are all screaming that they are the center of the universe. Okay? I'll take me as an example. I have a marketing person that sits in my office, and I have an academic writer who sits in my office. I have a bunch of people who sit in South America and in Europe who do work on my team. The people who sit in Europe and South America fundamentally resent the 2 people who sit in my office on the list of priorities, because one person can walk over and tap on my shoulder, and one person has to send me an email. There's a fundamental lack of siloed access. When we're trying to figure out our priorities and trying to build a team, because the reality is building a mine today involves a team, we have to realize that behind each of these name list of people, there is humans, there's problems, there are conversations, there are issues. So coming at it, we've got other governments. Government is this lovely big word, and we use it as a placeholder, but there's lots of parts to the government. There's communities that have says. There's shareholders. There's management who's trying to balance everything. There's an entire development team that has a goal to bring it in under budget. Okay, by the way, Bain came out with a report that said all mining projects are 20% over budget. And I think that was the most conservative estimation of budget over that I've seen in the industry, because the last report I saw was 43%. But you know, under budget is this wonderful, mythical
20% between friends.
Yeah, between friends is 20%. Then we got the end users, we got the operators, we got evil traders like me, which I used to be. We got external businesses, we got advisors. We could go down this entire list. Everyone is out driving the decision from their perspective. And that makes that fundamental core joint venture between community, governments at all levels, and the mine, that 3-way joint venture between those 3 parties, not necessarily respected, because it's just too noisy to actually bring that to a focus. And that's a problem that we are seeing. That's a problem that we think is fixable. Or at least we can help fix.
Well, it's fixable, but it's not easy. Look at all this group, and this isn't a total list. There's more stakeholders. This is just a starting point. And then all these groups
Just
have
look at who's in this
subgroups.
room.
Yeah. Yeah.
We got everything from environmental permitters to geologists to metallurgists to another metallurgist to people who work in industry, current government officials, academic researchers. I mean, that's just in one room, and we're all supposed to come together and agree on something.
Yep.
Without necessarily a quantification of understanding of what, or qualification of what agreement makes sense. So, what's our solution? Our solution is simple, okay? And me and Ben don't have all the answers. If you want someone who has all the answers, I think there's Harvard or MIT, there's places that where they claim to have all the answers. Our view is build unified business education. Our view is simple, which is one of the reasons why we do what we do. We believe that if you give people simple business tools and simple ratios and simple values, people are going to make not the best decision, they're going to make better decisions. Now, I was looking at what better means versus best. We have a culture where we need to get to perfect. And me and Ben are the exact opposite. Angela was here for our first class. We were way worse at teaching 4 years ago. We didn't know how to build stories. We didn't know how to present. Half our curriculum wasn't written when we initially wrote this thing. And we've become much more focused on how to teach and grow this. Does that make sense? We've been learning how to do this. The key is to actually get unified education, to get unified language, to get language that's not just focused on one thing. And we've done a large part about this. We have in the last 4 years taught over 800 students. And if you include lunch and learns, it's probably closer to 5,000 or 6,000. Last week, now that I've got a social media manager, who would have thought, last week I touched 49,000 unique individuals. Does that make sense? So we're building a very large voice that's focused on very simple concepts. We're not trying to fix everything. We're trying to create a new middle class. Because we don't believe that change comes from the C-level. We believe change comes from change in the middle class that then changes the C-level. We believe that change has to come over time versus being instantaneous. And we're incredibly happy to make this work. And we made it work. More importantly, we've had diversity. One of the big problems I think that we have, which comes back to Cheryl's comment, I'm sorry to pick on you, Cheryl, but your comment was absolutely brilliant, and I could have paid you to set me up for it, was that we have an industry that looks like me and Ben. The senior manager industry are bald white guys. We have ore bodies that looks like Angela and Cheryl and Joseph and Peggy and Tina and Ken and Pim and everyone else. We have a broad range of people who actually live on top of the ore bodies, who own the ore bodies, who are there. We need to get diversity. And one of the things we've done, thanks to WIM, thanks to everyone else, is we maintain 50-50.
Natural Resource Canada.
Yep, who's paid a lot of our bills, which has been lovely. So our goal is to educate change. And our goal is to change the conversation from being purely emotional or purely about stories to bring quantification into it so that people actually understand why business decisions are good versus bad from a real natural capital perspective. So before we get there, we have 10 minutes for questions, which means we time this perfectly. We'll do 2 quick slides.
Yeah.
We run a very quick program just because we have to sell for a second. 4 courses. Scholarships are open today for people who are online. Those scholarships will close July 3rd, and then we're going to start actually selling slots. Up to this point, we've been operating almost entirely on scholarships. And now that we have marketing team, we're going to be focusing on blending the cohort with more corporate involvement, which means, by the way, that no, I don't think we're going to be able to maintain 50-50 male-female participation, because companies will not buy seats on that ratio, which is kind of sad.
We're still going to try.
We're going to try, but we're not sure we're going to actually pull that off. And money does help this process. So, yeah, so we're working very hard on building this thing. And I think it's an important overall perspective. Yes, Dave, we put in the luncheon, we put in this scholarship application. Dave is our messaging. Oh, yes. Oh, sorry, I'm doing things wrong. There's all these things working. work out. So what are we doing right now? We're in the process of raising money. So we're doing a lot of lunch and learns, primarily to learn how to sell to different groups of people, to learn trigger words, to learn other things. So we're taking content from different perspectives. Since we've raised almost 80% of our money from government organizations, we actually started to work on empathy with them, which Dave's response was, why don't you write a lunch and learn about that? So this is what you get today. And yes, Cheryl, we probably did not make it nearly human enough in the beginning. To be fair, Ben deleted a slide, which I was going to use to humanize it.
Oh, come on. Timing's perfect because Ben deleted the slide.
Oh, yeah. Well, we
And I
we can work
rearranged
that
your slides.
back and forth.
Hey, I asked for consent before I rearranged your slides.
You did.
I knew
You did. I actually had the human stuff relatively early, and then you moved it. We moved it down. It was very funny because I started backwards that way, and then we got flipped. And this is fun. Cool. So questions, feedback. We have 9 minutes, and discussion is the best part of these things.
Yes.
Open up your mic. Fire away.
Talk to us.
Angela, you got enough AC in Phoenix? Sorry, Tucson? Or are you roasting?
Yeah, no, there's enough, using enough, copper-based resources to keep us cool here. And water-based resources.
That's a good thing.
And okay,
Yeah.
so this is on water. I mean, it gets complicated sometimes. I heard a thing on the radio. I'd read a little bit about it before, but in Arizona, mostly desert, I guess, there was a company that got the water rights to some place in Western Arizona, and they're drilling down. And then what they're doing is using the water to grow hay, which they're cutting and then shipping to the Middle East. And that was an election thing, and maybe it helped dethrone the previous administration, I'm not sure. But what this investigative reporter is finding out is that apparently one of the big investors in this program was the Arizona State Pension Fund. So essentially, government workers were financing the shipping of water out of the state of Arizona. So governments.
And to put in perspective, Angela, the water in hay is less than 30 cents a cubic meter. Copper mining in Arizona, even with head grades, is almost $60 a cubic meter with current technology. So Arizona at 30 cents a cubic meter in hay, that's the maximum revenue per cubic meter for growing hay, is 30 cents to maybe $1 if you really are good with your water, with your irrigation of the hay. Like if you're perfect, you're at $1. It's in that range perspective. You know what I mean? It's just really, really interesting how little we value it in most outcomes. And once you start valuing it, mining will get more water because we generate the most GDP per capita per cubic meter of water of any industry in the world. We just have to be willing to say that and then figure out how to be even better. But yeah, Angela, your case is perfect.
Yeah, to timelines though, I mean, they're looking at, drawing down the water table within like 20 years. And the people, even if the people living there paid the water farmer, they're called, for the water, there's not going to be any left if they keep draining it for the export market. Yep. And so the people will have to move somewhere. And and this is not a 500-year time frame. This is 20 years. So a bit of a it was just a surprising thing I heard on the radio.
Valuing natural capital in all forms as we go into massive scarcity is going to become far more important. So, Morgan, I don't know how to sell to junior miners. I tried running one and I was bad at it. I don't know that I know how to solve the junior mining business. I think that the bigger problem we face is 90% of our footprint is the top 300 mines. So our goal is to start by changing the top versus the bottom. Because it's the same amount of work. Yeah, sure.
I was just going to say on the water, I used to manage the water portfolio for the province of Ontario. It's pretty complex in the sense that the issues down where Angela is completely different than here, right? We have a lot of dewatering happening up in Canada versus, down in Chile, there isn't enough water, right? So, valuing it is very hard to do when you have so many different climate zones with different issues, right? So like Coca-Colas of the world and stuff, they always have these conversations. How do you value the water? It's highly, I mean, one of the major things that I think the average citizen doesn't understand is that water is highly subsidized with its energy cost to pump it to the different areas. People don't even understand, like I say, the next goal is it's not your energy costs, it's going to be your water costs. So this highly subsidized sector is not understood by the average person. So we as a water, you know, we have lots of water here. I don't think we're going to understand that impact until we actually have the cost relative to what it costs to go to the average household. So it's increasing significantly. I think it's gone up 15% in 1 year just in my region. So it's complex, I think, in that realm.
Wholeheartedly agree. 57 to 75% of all the copper we're going to get is going to come from water scarce regions. More than that on the lithium. So Ontario is uniquely blessed with water. But I remember having a lovely conversation in Ontario with the CEO of one of the largest miners in the region. And he said water cost him at least $1 a cubic meter to touch in his mine site. And when we attached the dollar per cubic meter to a bunch of his operations, even at that major operation in Ontario, massive shifts from a cost perspective were rational. Even thickener control systems pay back in less than 20 days in Ontario. So we're not saying that the water has the same drastic values as the Atacama Desert. We're not saying everything you do in the Atacama, you're going to do in Sudbury. We're just saying if you start quantifying it and then coming back to the original question, which is this a constraint, which is one of our first slides. Sorry, I'm going to go down because I'm that level of nuts. Where did we put that slide? Did we delete it? No, we didn't delete it. Fine. Understanding actual business constraints. Not all water in all locations is a business constraint.
Nope.
We get that. We just think that for a lot of mines, it is a business constraint, so it's an easy low-hanging fruit.
But
more importantly, it's one that when we,
But this is one thing that we also struggle with as humans and as society. Just look at how we're so passionate and so excited about carbon emissions. You know, now in some parts of our society, reducing those carbon emissions makes absolute sense. But if you're reducing carbon emissions in mining at the cost of losing metal recovery, which we definitely need, and copper has a massive multiplier effect once it goes into a windmill or a solar panel or an EV in reducing those carbon emissions, are we looking at it the most sensible way possible? And that's the hard thing. It's not one size fits all. There are examples where, yeah, it'd be better to reduce it. But there's other examples where, heck yeah, spend as much carbon as you can to get that metal out of the ground because the multiplier effect is fantastic. And I think the first step is just acknowledging that the problems we're facing aren't simple problems. They aren't one size fits all solutions. It's going to be case by case. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this. We've planted some ideas in your head and created more good than harm. And yeah, please connect with us.
And if you think we're going to solve the world's mining industry problems in 58 minutes, you're wrong. Does that make sense? The point of this is to get people to think. The point of these monthly lunch and learns is to take a topic and approach it from a completely different perspective than was seen before. We very easily, I'll give you the caveat, everything we said today could be wrong. We're not saying we are necessarily the best at this. We're saying we believe that only by changing and flipping and turning can we get closer to right. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see you next month.
If you haven't joined us before, apply for a scholarship. They're out now. We put some links in.
And if you have joined us and gotten a scholarship from us, share it with your network.
Please.
Because the reality is we want more people from Papua New Guinea or Ghana or other places. We don't believe that we should just be teaching the current status quo. Thank you all. Amazing. Cheers and all the best.